Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here, and I want to take you back to November 9th, 2022. November 9th, 2022 was about a week before my 40th birthday. And actually, it was my dad's 85th birthday, but that's not related to the story at all. It was Wednesday night. It was the last game of my rec league soccer season. We already knew we weren't going to make the playoffs. I think we missed out by one game. So we knew it was basically a meaningless game. Right? One last run out to close out the year. And so, of course, those of you who know the story know that that was the game that I got knocked down on and fractured my wrist. Entirely meaningless game. Of course, I didn't initially know I'd fractured my wrist. I'm used to just bouncing back up, taking a breather, and going back into the game. But obviously, the next time I had to push myself up, I stayed out. I iced my wrist when I got home. I tried to rest it. I took some painkillers. I was like, in a few days, this will pass, because that's usually what happens. But we happened to have a friend staying at our house that weekend who happened to be a nurse practitioner. And by happened, I mean, thank the Lord, because she said, you should probably get it checked out. It might just heal on its own, or worst case, like you'll lose your hand. I'm not even joking. It was motivation enough to go get some x-rays done, and eventually that led to a surgery where I had a decent-sized screw. I think we have a picture. No, that's not. Yep. There it is, right here. A decent-sized screw inserted into my scaphoid bone to hold it together, which has left this decent-sized scar. Which is the latest in the litany of scars that I document in Learning to Live. There's one just below my left knee from roller skating 30 years ago. There's one across my nose from a teenage temper tantrum. The one I shared about last fall where I fell down a mountain trying to impress a girl. The things that you miss out on when you don't, when you're not here. There's just so much revelation. Here's what I wrote in Learning to Live. It is impossible to go through life without scars. Just as suffering is unavoidable, so are scars. Some of them are physical, from an accident we survived or an act of youthful impulsiveness. Some are scars which are emotional, how we react to the possibility of a relationship, or how much we are able to trust someone of the opposite sex, or someone in authority, or a parent figure. Some are psychological, the unwanted remnants of a difficult childhood or an abusive relationship. Some scars are spiritual, particularly if we or our family have been hurt by other Christians or by pastors. Living in a fallen world, there is no way to not get hurt in some way or other. Some of the wounds that we suffer hurt like crazy, and sometimes it can feel as though those wounds will never heal. Our passage for the day is Psalm 23, which I'll touch on a little bit later. It won't be woven throughout the message or unpacked in depth, but I'd like to read it again to set the tone for what's to come. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He lets me rest in grassy meadows. He leads me to restful waters. He keeps me alive. He guides me in proper paths for the sake of his good name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they protect me. You set a table right in front of my enemies. You bathe my head in oil. My cup is so full it spills over. Yes, goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the Lord's house as long as I live. We are just over halfway through the journey of Learning to Live, which is a discipleship and spiritual formation experience that I wrote for our church to help us grow in the likeness of Jesus. We're in week 7 of 11 weeks worth of material. So including today, we have 5 weeks to go. Our final Sunday in the series will be Easter Sunday, March 31st, when we'll celebrate Resurrection Day and we will celebrate completing Learning to Live together. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll have 2 services, 9 and 11, and an opportunity to be baptized, so I hope you'll plan on being with us that day. Over the last almost 2 months, we've traversed a good bit of territory. We've covered a lot of ground. Think back to where you were at the beginning of the year. We started with some of Jesus' initial questions. What do you want? Who do you say I am? What do you want from me? Because God meets each of us where we are. You took time to dig into your story, the relationships, the experiences, the blessings, and the trials that have made you who you are today. And some of you shared those with your small groups. We step back to reflect on how your story and our stories fit into God's story of good news, of creation, redemption, fall, redemption, and renewal. You reflected on what you're made for, to be formed in the likeness of Jesus, to be made increasingly to grow in our love for God and our love for others, in our freedom. We were made to grow in freedom, not in this individualistic sense, this American sense of being free from, but in the holistic and relational and communal way of being free for, being free to love one another. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Matthew talked about how to live this full life, unpacking that beautiful interplay between God and us, God's grace and our participation. And then last week, Pastor Lisa talked to us about prayer, one of the core practices for staying connected with God through communion, through resting and abiding, and through communication as well, expressing ourselves and listening to God. In the remaining weeks, we will look at the Bible. We'll look at another core resource for learning who God is and who we are, learning how not to live as much as learning how to live. We'll talk about the church, about who we are together, who we were intended to be, who we could be, the community into which we are welcomed and in which we are formed when we choose to follow Jesus. And there will also be a week where we remember together that none of this is just for self-improvement. None of this is purely out of self-interest, but for the purposes of the flourishing of all creation. And that demands things of us, working for justice, for example. So that's the journey of learning to live in a nutshell. But as we explored in our Ecclesiastes series last fall, none of this is a formula, right? Faith is not a formula. And as much as we might like to think that we can set our hearts and our minds on something and then it's a straight shot to glory, that is not, unfortunately, how life works. Grace, as Dallas Willard would say, is opposed to earning, but it is not opposed to effort. And yet, effort does not always equal output, at least not in equal proportions. There are other forces, there are other wills, there are other people, other powers and principalities, other systems and structures at work as well, all seeking the establishment of their own kingdoms. And that includes us. We all seek our own kingdoms, which is just another way of saying we want things to be the way we want them to be. If anybody here does not think that that applies to them, we can work through that. But we all want things to be the way we want them to be, which is to seek our own kingdoms. Sometimes that way that we want things to be may not always be what God wants. And so this week we're recognizing quite simply that there are things in our lives and in our world that may keep us from living as fully as God desires. Some of those things we learn to overcome, and some we learn to endure. And the alliterative devotional topics for overcoming and enduring this week and learning to live are sin, self, Satan, suffering, and scars. Sin, self, Satan, suffering, and scars. Now, I'm not going to rehash all the material from the week. There's a lot of it, and it's a pretty heavy week. May have stirred some things up for you. I know it has for me. Each of these topics may hold a different weight for each of us. Different triggers, different flavors, different memories in our feelings, in our spirits, even in our bodies. How we feel tense when we hear a certain word or we think of a certain concept. We may think of an interaction or experience that directly impacted us. Something we did that we wish we could take back. Or something that was done to us that we wish had never happened. We may think of what we saw on the news or on social media just this morning or last night. More suffering and death in Gaza, in our city, in our neighborhoods. We may think of the sin entrenched in political and legal systems and educational and health systems, sin that oppresses, sin that marginalizes, sin that exploits the already vulnerable. We may think of lost loved ones or failed relationships, trying and hopeless seasons, or even trying and hopeless presents. This morning I'm going to offer 4 practices for overcoming and enduring, things to help us along the way. And I made them all sort of start with the letter D, and I say sort of because, well, you'll see. But the first practice is disclose or share. See, I forced it a little bit. If you're going through something, if you are struggling to overcome sin or yourself or some spiritual opposition or anxiety or voices that aren't speaking life, or if you are in the grind of enduring some suffering, some illness, some trauma, I want you to know, and I want you to know clearly that it is a privilege and an honor for our staff and elders to walk with you, for our prayer counselors to pray with you. And in my case as a pastor, it is my job, and even more than that, it is my calling. Accompanying people on this journey of life and faith, meeting you where you are and going with you and with Jesus toward the thriving life of God's kingdom. There's a stereotype of a pastor who, gets called at the drop of a hat. Cat gets stuck in a tree, call the pastor. That's also for firemen, But for whatever reason, that stereotype, it doesn't hold as much for us, doesn't apply as much for us. Maybe it's the self-sufficiency you all have because you're used to just doing. You're used to just solving the problem. You're used to just trying harder, working on it. Maybe you know we're busy and you don't want to bother us. Maybe there's shame involved, fear of being judged, or the fear that saying something out loud to another person might make it seem more real or too real or real for the first time. Maybe you can't name all the reasons. Maybe you're genuinely connected to all the support systems and people that you need to be, in which case, praise the Lord. But if it is any of the other reasons, let me say it again as clearly as I can, that it is a privilege and an honor, and absolutely not an inconvenience or an imposition. Anytime we get to be invited to be with you in person, in spirit, in support, in prayer, through a hard season or situation or circumstance. I'll say this again later, but if you want or need any support of any kind, you can talk to me, one of the staff or elders. You can go to a prayer counselor. You can fill out a connection card or add a prayer request. We are here for you and with you. So please tell someone if you're going through something. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be another pastor or elder or staff member. It doesn't have to be a prayer counselor. It might be a friend. It might be a partner. It might be a family member. It might be your small group leaders, a therapist, or a spiritual director. I personally am not concerned with knowing all of the juicy details. I just want to make sure you don't go through your hard season more alone than you need to be. There may well be pieces and parts that you alone can carry. All right? No one can choose the better way for you. No one else can determine how much effort you make. No one else can admit your powerlessness over whatever has you in its grasp. But we were made for relationship. We were made to thrive in relationship. We need each other. All right? This is not just a theological point as well. Scientific research backs this up. The physical consequences in our bodies of a lack of relational connections they're devastating to our health. Relational isolation or loneliness can lead to an increased risk by at least 25% of heart disease and stroke, and in older adults, dementia, an equivalent impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The U.S. Surgeon General released a report just last year describing loneliness and isolation as an epidemic. Even before the pandemic, half of U.S. adults reported experiencing measurable levels of loneliness, which is to do with the quality of your relational connections. We're sold this promise of connection and connectivity, these fleeting glimpses into other people's lives who may be our friends, and yet we are lonelier than ever. Disclose, then, is shorthand for make sure you have people around you. Invest in quality connections, those who can encourage you, those whose hard truths you'll listen to, because we all have those friends who have no problem sharing those hard truths, but we may not listen to them. Those who model for you the love and the character of Jesus. The Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, "Carry each other's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ." So disclose. Don't go it alone. Second, discern. There was a brief season in high school where I loved chemistry. I had a teacher that really made the science come to life. I loved the experiments that we got to do, especially the ones that involved things burning up. Anything that required watching from behind protective glass, honestly. A regular request from our class was dropping potassium into sulfuric acid, which results in a beautiful violet flame and then sometimes the glass shattering. And understandably, our teacher was like, "No, we can't afford a new beaker every week," or something responsible like that. Or, learning that water shouldn't be used to put out every kind of fire is pretty helpful, right? Public service announcement: do not use water on an electrical fire or any fire involving flammable liquids like oil. That will only make things worse. Just checking that we're all on the same page there. The reason we need to discern and be discerning in hard times is that different reasons for our difficult seasons may demand different responses. I was trying to think of a rhyme, but I couldn't. Different reasons for our difficult seasons may demand different responses. It matters if you're experiencing an electrical fire or a wood fire. If you're going through a sulfuric acid season, do not drop potassium in there unless you want something to explode. Discernment is key. Not everything we have to overcome or endure, for example, is sin. It can feel really easy to externalize the problem, to point the finger at someone or something that's hurt us and label them as the sinner, the one in the wrong. But life isn't always that black and white. Sometimes it is. Sometimes we can call genocide genocide. But when someone disagrees with you or has a different perspective than you, may not necessarily be sin. Or when is something spiritual opposition? When is the devil busy? All the time, sure. But not everything we don't want to hear is spiritual opposition. All right? Not everything we don't want to hear is the enemy at work. Not everything that rubs you the wrong way is spiritual opposition. I have known far too many Christians who reacted as though any disagreement or pushback or something they said or did or a decision they made was spiritual opposition. Now, I understand it. Because if we feel like we're trying to follow God and listen to God and obey God and go where God wants us to go, and then we encounter pushback, well, that must not be from God. And it may be spiritual opposition, but it might also be God trying to get through to you through someone else because you're actually standing in your own way or in the way of God's flourishing. Just maybe. It's another option. Just saying. Or that question of suffering. Can we ever know what good God will bring out of it except with hindsight? What if we never get to see that good? What if we never get to celebrate the redemption? What if God never comes through in a way that we get to celebrate? Then was that suffering in vain? These are questions that we wrestled with in the fall in Ecclesiastes. That whole series felt like giving a megaphone to all the inner voices. And it wasn't bad. It was hard to walk through it. It was hard to be in it. Discernment of our seasons isn't easy. I'm sure we wish we could just diagnose all the reasons why we are where we are so we'd know what to take to fix the problem. We will never know everything perfectly, certainly this side of Christ's return. But the fact that we will never know everything perfectly should not keep us from trying to discern what we can so that we can try to do something well. Try to take the next healthy step. 7 years ago, I was in a hard season at another church. It was a season where I picked up a lot of scars. I was feeling tired and worn out. Actually, 7 years ago this week, I had handed in my resignation and was wondering if I would return to ministry at all. It was in this season that what would become Christ City was being birthed, though none of us knew it at the time. And certainly it was not happening in the way or the timing or the process we would have liked. Because some paths we get to choose, and others are chosen for us. In that season, I was wondering what I was going to do. Pastor Matthew was also asking me what I was going to do. My wife was also asking me what I was going to do. Carolyn got to see all of the mess and all of the consequences, had to help me bear a lot of it, had to support me through much of it. And she said, rightly and caringly, she said, how can you even think about being back in ministry? Why would you put yourself back into a context that would lead you back to this place of burnout and exhaustion? In order to not simply react out of the immediate hurt and harm or out of the issues that were being triggered, the ways of coping I had learned from my family or the church culture I've been a part of, I had to take time to discern, to wrestle with God about the season I was in. What role had sin played? Failure to love by those in power. What role did I, myself, my ego, my inclinations to avoid conflict, what role did I play? What was the spiritual landscape? In this season, I prayed a lot on my own, speaking out loud to God and trying to listen to what God had to say to me. Sometimes just being together with God, communing with the God of all comfort and consolation. I prayed a lot with others. I talked and processed with Carolyn, with Matthew and Lisa, with my family, with my brothers who are also pastors, with close friends, with my spiritual director. And this is where discernment and disclosure go together. Discernment should never be a solo undertaking, should never just be a solo undertaking. There is always a part for you to discern and to decide, but we need those relational connections, those to whom our lives are intertwined to give insight where we can't see it, to point out what we may not know, and to offer wise counsel for our good when the road ahead is foggy. Eventually, over the course of a few months, I came to a place of being able to recognize that my exhaustion and burnout, it wasn't from ministry per se, but from a particular relationship and a particular power dynamic that had been used against me. I came to a place of recognizing that I love ministry. The gift, the honor, the privilege, as I said, of being with folks as they journey through life and faith, the high moments and the low moments. It is an honor and a privilege. I came to recognize that I had always been a pastor, even before I was called a pastor, even before I was paid to be a pastor, that was a passion that I had to come alongside folks. This was an affirmation at a deeper level than just what job I should do or what church I should be at. It was a reminder of who I was. But let none of that fool you into thinking that any of it was easy. It was one of the hardest seasons of my life. But discerning with God and in community was key to getting through it as well and as healthily as I could. So disclose and discern. And here's where I stretch the alliteration again. Take the elevator down. There's a D in there. Take the elevator down. This is the analogy and the counsel given to me a number of years ago by my therapist. She was inviting me to go deeper into my feelings. She was inviting me to go deeper into my feelings because I was so wired to try to avoid conflict with others, and because, let's be honest, feelings can be challenging, that what I do was I would share enough to tide others over. So they'd be like, okay, he seems like he's processing stuff pretty healthily. Good. And what I wouldn't do often was actually work through my feelings on my own. What was actually going on? In the words of another friend and spiritual director, take time to feel. Take time to feel. It can seem like there's not enough time to feel, or that there's too much to do to take time to feel. I said to him once, I'm a little worried that if I open up this box, then I'll end up a mess on the floor and I won't be able to get any of the things done that I need to get done. And he said, well, that may be true. But what is definitely true is that if you don't open up this box, you will definitely end up unable to do the things that you need to do. Now, of course, not everything has to be processed all at once. Not everything can be processed all at once. But I wonder if in our world of what I've described as spiritual and emotional whiplash, where we swipe and there's more devastating news from Gaza, and we swipe and there's a hilarious meme that we have to send our friend, and we swipe and there's news about Taylor Swift, and we swipe and there's a travel post from a friend and we wish we were there rather than here, and we swipe and there's a report about crime or under-budget schools. I wonder if we might take the time to slow down and stop letting ourselves get used to this level of what I might describe as emotional multitasking. There's spiritual multitasking. Just as our brains aren't actually wired to multitask, we just learn to do lots of things okay with a lot of stopping and starting, so also I would suggest that our hearts aren't wired to emotionally multitask, and our souls aren't wired to spiritually multitask. We will not be able to structure everything into pure blocks of emotion or processing, and the currents of life in our world and in our culture certainly don't help. But when can we take some moments of concentrated time to allow God to become present to us in all of our feelings? I think it would be helpful and healthy. I think it's helpful and healthy to allow ourselves to name what we're grateful for, to give thanks, to feel joy, to laugh. And I think it's helpful and healthy, and maybe more necessary if we don't want to become desensitized to the trouble and suffering in the world, for us to lament, to cry, to grieve. Cuban-American writer Kat Armas writes this in her book, Sacred Belonging. Grief can seem pitiful, offensive, or inconvenient to some Christians, as it has nothing to do with a victorious God. To those who have embraced an imperial Christ, grief is weakness. But this is precisely why we need to grieve, as resistance and as a spiritual practice. We need tears that cleanse, as Joanna Macy says. Our grief is not a private burden, but a shared experience on this planet. So let us lament. It means we're listening. Take the elevator down. Don't settle for skimming the surface. Don't settle for surviving through coping mechanisms that lead only to a half-life at most. Delve into the depths of your eternal soul, and you will discover God there too. And you will discover God's life there too. Because at the end of it all, what will get us through, what will allow us to overcome or endure whatever season of hardship and adversity, or sickness and suffering, or pain and difficulty, what will bring healing to us and bring healing through us, what it all depends on is the God who is love. There's a song I learned as a kid. My mouth is a little dry, but I'll see what I can do. I cast all my cares upon you. I lay all of my burdens down at your feet. And anytime I don't know what to do, I cast all my cares upon you. Comes from a verse in 1 Peter 5. In the old King James Version, it says, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. So depend on God. Lean on the Lord who is a shepherd, the one in whom you lack nothing, the one who will let you rest and lead you to life-giving waters, the one who keeps us alive, the one who guides us in proper paths, the one who is with us in the darkest valley of despair, of desperation, of doubt, of disappointment, of death, of difficulty, of depression, the one who watches over our souls even if our lives may be in danger, the one whose goodness and faithful love pursue us all the days of our lives. Depend on God. Writer Anne Lamott said, "Where do we even start on the daily walk of restoration and awakening? We start where we are. We find God in our human lives, and that includes the suffering. Lean on the Lord who is our shepherd, and the Lord who is our good shepherd, one who came that we might have life to the full, who came to show us what life to the full looks like, who came to make a way so that we might know that life, that love, that flourishing, and who invites us into that life and into that same work of bringing life and love and flourishing to those around us as well." As I said, none of this is a formula for flourishing. None of it is guaranteed to pay off in the ways we may expect. But there are truths that hold. And there are truths we may have to hold on to in the face of the evidence to the contrary. What I see in Scripture, in the revelation of Jesus Christ as the fullness of God and the example for all humanity, what I have experienced in my own life and seen in the lives of others, is the God who is love. The God whose love redeems and rescues, liberates and lifts up. The God whose good news comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. The God who is the Lord, our shepherd, the one on whom we can depend, the one who is faithful, the one who is, as we sang earlier, always with us. In the Gospels, we read that after the resurrection, Jesus still bore the scars from the nails that pierced his hands and feet, the spear that entered his side. Even with his glorified, eternal, resurrected body, Jesus carried the marks of his death. And so maybe when we're resurrected, we'll bear the scars that we bore for the sake of the kingdom. The scars that God redeemed and brought healing out of. Maybe in that day we might finally experience the full understanding of Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for good for the ones who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. But until that day, may we find our way through this life, overcoming and enduring what we can, enduring what we must, flourishing where we can, at the side of our good shepherd. It is the only way. Would you pray with me?